I will right away start because of the time. Well, I will start with feeding in feral equids. And when we look at what feral equids are eating all day long, then they're grazers, so they eat grass, which is quite poor in nutrient content, but very rich in fiber. And the feeding behavior is a very synchronized behavior, so usually the horses of a group all feed at the same time. And they do that for about 12 to 18 hours per day in about 15 to 20 periods. And if you look at the feeding behavior, they voluntarily never have breaks that are longer than 4 hours. So after a 4-hour break, they start eating again, also during the night. In general, one could say that the digestive systems in terms of the intestinal microbiota is adapted to a continuous nutrient uptake, and that the feeling of satiety is not similar to most of mammals. So the feeling of satiety is not achieved by the stimulation of stretch receptors with a filled stomach. Horses don't have these stretch receptors. But the satiety is achieved by a fatigue of the musculatory muscles. So horses should do about 90,000 bites and chews in 24 hours in order to get this feeling of satiety. When we come to stable equids, then the most important fact is that domesticated horses still have the exact same needs. But when we look at the diets, then we feed them hay and grass, which is usually richer in nutrient content because this is a special grass that we harvest. And it is still rich in fiber, which is okay, but then most of the horses are also fed concentrate additionally to that, and concentrate usually is very rich in nutrient content, but very poor in fiber. And when it comes to feeding regime, then usually feeding times are provided 2 or 3 times a day. And the amount of feed that they get is rationed because it's higher in nutrient content. And with this fact, also the duration of availability is restricted. And in general, feed, in terms of achieving a feeling of satiety, is often a limited resource for horses, although they get enough nutrients, of course. When we look at group-housed horses, then one could see that there is often a competition for a limited resource. Of course, individually housed horses cannot show this competition because they're housed individually, but in groups you can see that there is an increased occurrence and intensity of agonistic behaviors, especially at feeding times. And that's why we ask ourselves how the organization and duration of these feeding times affect the agonistic behavior in the group-housed horses, which aspects of the feeding management reduce the extent of agonistic behavior, and which role the group composition plays. The study we did was conducted in 50 groups with 390 horses. There were all group housing systems on Swiss practical farms, 50 different farms as well. And in each group, we made behavior observations on one day. And then the data I'm presenting now is the data we collected once 30 minutes before a feeding time, which is referred to as the pre-feed period, and the first 30 minutes after the feeding time, the feed was provided. So the first 30 minutes of the feeding time, which is called the feed period. We did a continuous all-event sampling. All horses were observed directly with 2 trained observers. And the behaviors we observed was agonistic behavior, and we gathered these in 3 groups. The first group is approach and push, which are agonistic behaviors with a very low intensity. Then threatening behavior, which was threat, bite threat, and kick threat, and aggressive behavior like bite, kick, attack, and chase. And those, of course, are the behaviors that are most likely causing injuries. The group housing system, all groups were group housed 24/7, so all the time together, and all stable systems had a separated run area, a littered lying area, and a feeding area, which was either additionally or which was in the run, placed in the run area as well. The space per horse varied quite a lot, from 11 to up to 400 square meters. Please note that all the parameters that are in blue are those that ended up in our model. So we checked for those if they actually had a direct influence on the agonistic behavior. Regarding the group compositions, we had groups from 4 up to 21 horses. They were all adult, at least 2 years old. The residency, so for how long they've been already in their group, varied from 1 month up to 19 years. And we had 188 mares and 202 geldings, but we decided not to focus on the sex of the individual, but on the sex ratio in the group. So we had same-sex groups with geldings or only mares, and that varied up to completely equally mixed groups. I will start now with the results of the feeding management. So how was the feeding management of these practical farms? The duration of straw availability varied, but although 39 groups had straw ad libitum, but there were also 11% of horses which had access to straw for 2 hours or less a day. Hay was usually provided 2 or 3 times a day, but again, the duration of availability varied extremely from 1.5 hours up to 24 hours. And only 21% of the horses had access to hay for 12 hours or longer. The number of feeding places varied. The 65% of the groups had fixed feeding times, which means that the horse awaited the food within a period of 30 minutes, which is the same every day. And we saw a different feeding system, and I will come to this on the next slide. One feeding system was floor, which means that the horses were fed loose hay on the ground. Then we saw fodder racks, feed fences. The difference here is that the horse have to stick their head and neck into the vertical bars. So in order, if they're getting displaced, first they have to step backwards so that they're able to walk away. That was the difference to the rack. Then we had a narrow meshed hay net that started at 6 by 6 centimeters up to 2 or down to 2 by 2, which you can see in the picture on the right. Then we had feed stands where each horse had an individual stall where it went into. And here we differentiated between feed stands where the horses still had contact in the front with the head, so they could threaten each other at least, or feed stands where physical contact was completely permitted. And we also had stables with a combination of several of these feeding systems. Okay. Now, results of the threatening behavior. From the totally observed behavior, threatening behavior was 63.5%, and it was shown by 74% of the horses in all groups. Now, when we come to our model where we checked which of the parameters actually have an influence on the threatening behavior, then we calculated the general linear mixed effect model, and we saw that the feeding system in interaction with the period had an effect, as well as the residency and the sex ratio. But all the other parameters did not have an influence on threatening behavior. How were these influences? Well, the influence of the residency with an odds ratio of 1.05 is very low. So the possibility that a horse showed more threatening behavior the older it got was like 0.5%. So it's not a very clear influence, but it was there. It was a bit clearer for the sex ratio. The higher the percentage of mares was in the group, the higher was the possibility that the horses showed threatening behavior. Actually, it was 2.7 times higher. For the feeding system in interaction with the period, I will quickly explain this figure. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of horses that show threatening behavior. And on the x-axis, you have, for once, the period, so this pre-feed period and the feed period, and the different feeding systems. And then the dots represent the individual groups, the mean of the individual groups, and the light green line is the mean in the pre-feed period, and the dark green line is the mean in the feed period. So what you can see here is that in the feeding system's net and the feed stand with and without contact, we had the lowest ratios of horses that showed threatening behavior. For aggressive behavior accounted for 7% of the all observed agonistic interactions, and it was shown by 23.1% of the horses in 76 groups. Here we found an influence again of the feeding system and also of the duration of hay availability in interaction with the period. For all the other parameters, there was no effect on aggressive behavior. For the feeding system, again, the same graph. Now the percentage of horses that showed aggressive behavior is on the y-axis. Here you can see that the horses in the feeding system net showed the least percentage of aggressive behavior. We were quite surprised that the horses that are fed on the floor showed a lot of aggressive behavior in the pre-feed period, because usually, the floor is we use the floor as the reference system, because this is how horses eat in nature. So usually they eat loose hay or loose grass from the floor, but in group house system we had quite high levels of aggressive behavior, especially in the pre-feed period. For the effect of the duration of hay availability, here we saw that in the pre-feed period, the possibility that the horse showed aggressive behavior was slightly higher the longer they had hay. But the effect again was very small. The odds ratio here is 1.08. On the other hand, in the feed period, it was very clear. The longer they had hay, the less aggressive behavior the horses showed, and here the effect was like 5 times smaller. For my discussion, there was only a very limited influence on the group composition, but the organization and duration had an impact. And the feed stand was the feeding system with the lowest levels of agonistic behavior. And, of course, that is also caused by the spatial separation and the individuality of the feeding places with limited contact. On the other hand, the net was the feeding system with the lowest level of aggressive behavior, and therefore the feeding system with the least risk of injury by other horses. And, of course, this effect is probably also even greater because of the character of the nets, because they automatically extend the duration of hay availability. There was a study that showed that the duration to eat 1 kilogram of hay was doubled from 40 minutes up to 86 minutes by a narrow-meshed mat with the size of 3 by 3 centimeters. And we try to explain this because when we come back to the feeling of satiety, which I said was a limited resource, then one could figure that not only eating hay but also eating straw gives the horse the feeling of satiety because they have to chew it. So we also expected that the straw duration would have an influence on the agonistic behavior, which it didn't. And then we tried to explain this, so we came up with the other key factor of feeding behavior, which is the nutrient uptake by the intestinal microbiota, so the digestive system. And then when you look at that, we figured that hay provides nutrients, but straw doesn't. So somehow the physiology of the digestive system might also have a direct influence of the agonistic behavior of the horses. So my take-home message is that we should allow horses to maintain their individual distances when they're fed in groups by feeding places with spatial distance or spatial separation. And we should also try to prevent all horses, also individually housed horses, I would say nearly ad libitum with hay, if that is possible somehow. And I'd like to thank you for your...